Hello and welcome to this video about correcting errors in language teaching. This is part of a series Keep It Short and Simple, and I am Ricardo Romero. You need to get a little bit of a context in the world. And when Pete Corder produced the book about errors and error analysis, you had to imitate, you had to have as a reference the native speaker. But nowadays, things have changed dramatically. You should know that in the world, out of 5 people who speak English now, 3 are non-native speakers like me. And there are only 2, that is a 40%, that are native speakers. The point now is that the exchanges of English in the world are completely varied and different. The number of native speakers of English differ in terms of their grammar, vocabulary, and that should not be considered a mistake. I would like to refer to you to 2 very interesting books. The first one is by Kirkpatrick, which is called World Englishes. It's right here. And the second one is the fantastic work done by David Crystal, English as a Global Language.
With these 2 references, the discussion is open. Native or non-native speakers. If you are a native speaker with an accent, or if you're not a native speaker with an accent, that is absolutely okay as far as you can be understood.
So let me just begin by saying that the definition of an error is an inaccuracy in speaking or writing caused by the learner's knowledge of the required form. But this refers only to learners. Just to clarify, it is important to keep in mind that when you make the error consistently or frequently, that is called a mistake. But when it is something that happens and you immediately want to correct, that should not be considered a mistake. That is just a slip of the tongue. There are 2 main sources for errors. The first one is the influence of the mother tongue, and the second one is the overgeneralization of the rules, which goes together with ignorance of the rule restrictions. So let's take the first one. For example, in vocabulary, it would be the false cognates or false friends, where students think that a word that they know in Spanish should be the same as that one that they think in English. So you find people saying, for example, assist is asistir and attend is atender.
So have a look at some of these words and begin to compare how many of these your students may be using or have used in your particular case.
The other one is when you think about that, the same influence, but not in terms of vocabulary, but also in terms of grammar. And it happens a lot. For example, when you ask a student, how old are you? A Spanish speaker will tend to say, I have 15 years. Because in Spanish, we use the word have, not the verb be. Another example, the expression, I want you to go. Spanish speakers will tend to produce, I want that you go, because that is how you say it in Spanish. Yo quiero que tú vayas. So it is there where you immediately realize that the mistake is really caused by the interference from the mother tongue. Now, the second group is the overgeneralization of the rule, which goes together with the ignorance of rules restrictions. So, for example, if you teach your students the past tense ed for regular verbs, for example, you say study, studied, then when you give them a verb like the verb go, they will tend to produce goed. And that is because they tend to generalize the rule, the ed for regular verbs to irregular verbs. There are many cases for comparatives and superlatives for the articles, the noun forms, etc. So that is called overgeneralization of the rule, which goes together with the idea of ignorance of rule restrictions. Now that we know this, I think that it's important to think about correcting mistakes and providing feedback. So when I refer to this, I don't think that the job of the teacher is so much correcting, but provide enough feedback so that students can produce the sentences that you want them to produce. So in order to do that, Stephen Krashen presented 2 hypotheses that are applicable to this case. The first one is the affective filter hypothesis.
The affective filter hypothesis states that learners with high motivation, self-confidence, a good self-image, a low level of anxiety and extroversion are better equipped for success in second language acquisition.
The psychological state, the tension or the happiness that students have in a certain moment in the class can help students understand better. When you provide students with feedback, please make sure that it is positive feedback, that you encourage the learners and you tell them it is completely okay to make mistakes. It is part of a process, nothing bad is going to happen. As opposed to what happened, with the behaviorist models, and particularly with the audiolingual approach, where mistakes were not accepted, and the idea was to produce drills and drills and drills so as to avoid students from making mistakes. Now, the second thing that I wanted to share with you is the monitor hypothesis.
Stephen Krashen asserted that a learner's learned system acts as a monitor to what they are producing. And when we talk about those learned systems, we're talking about the systems of grammar, the systems of vocabulary, the systems of pronunciation.
And that monitor theory implies that you are constantly monitoring the effect of your communication, and you will be ready to make the corrections, or at least ask questions if you need to ask them. Now that we have visited Krashen for a second, there are moments in the class where you need to provide that feedback or to correct. If you take just a simple model that may be traditional, where you have the beginning of the class, the middle of a class, and the end of a class, where at the beginning of the class you are modeling, you are presenting, you are giving the new information. Then in the second part of the class you are providing students with control practice they can try out, and you are there to help them out. And then the last part of the class, where they are producing freely, where they are expected to communicate in certain contexts, then definitely I would suggest that the best moment to correct should not be at the very beginning, because you're just presenting them with the language and the new structures and the new vocabulary. But in the second one, where you have the control practice, that is a good moment. It is a good moment because you are providing them with the structure or the vocabulary or the pronunciation, and then you can try with them and you provide them with feedback. But please remember, the fact that you taught them doesn't mean that they will internalize it. And the fact that they internalize it doesn't mean that they will be ready to produce. So there are some cases in English where students, even after 3 or 4 years of instructions, will tend to make the same mistakes. So be patient, it doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes some structures are really easy, very simple for the students, some are difficult to understand. So what errors are the ones that you're going to be correcting? My suggestion is focus on communication. And when you're talking about pronunciation, don't aim at perfection, particularly if the learner is not going to be a language teacher. Aim at intelligibility. So if they can be understood and what they say cannot lead to confusion, then they are right. Accents are welcome nowadays. And please embrace accents. Okay, so which errors to correct? You may feel tempted to correct every single error, and that is very detrimental to learning. Overcorrection does not lead to understanding. Overcorrection leads to frustration. Now, how do we correct? That will be the next thing. So, if what you do is that a student makes a mistake and you tell the student what the correct form is right away, for example, if I say she works at a factory, and then you say, oh, she works at a factory, you are doing something that is called recast. Recast is just providing the model. The second one is when you ask your students to try again, but with different words or other words, like you expect. You say, no, what did you say? What was it? She worked, what? And then with facial expressions, you are invited to produce. That system is called elicitation. In some other cases, when you ask the student to clarify or to explain what he or she means, that's another way of correcting. So in that case, you stop and say, excuse me, she work? What do you mean? And that is called clarification. That system, when you make faces and you make noises such as, what did you say? It is called metalinguistic feedback. Now, the other thing is when you give the students a clear explanation about the mistake. So you say, just a second. Remember, he, she, it, take third singular person. So in those cases, it is called explicit correction. And the last one is when you repeat exactly what the student said, but you raise your voice a little bit. For example, the student says, she work in a factory. And you say, like, she work in a factory? And that is a system of repetition that invites students to do something about that. You may be wondering how often those are used.
In 1997, Lister and Ranta produced a very interesting piece of research about the effectiveness of corrective feedback techniques.
In this study, it was demonstrated that recast tends to be the most used, the 55% of the occurrences. More than half of the teachers tend to just repeat the mistake and then students continue. 14% were elicitation, like asking students. 11 was clarification. Excuse me, did you say, what was it again? 8% were metalinguistic feedback. Explicit correction was 7% and repetition was 5%. So by far, recast tends to be the most common way of correcting mistakes. So when student says she works in a factory, the teacher says she works in a factory, and then that's it. But then they introduce a concept that is called uptake. And uptake is the effectiveness of the feedback that you provided the students with. And you will be surprised because you will see, for example, that recast, which is so common, has an uptake of 18%, 18% over 100. The idea of elicitation, like asking students for clarification, is 46%. So it is actually almost 3 times more effective than recast. Clarification request is at 28%. Metalinguistic feedback is 45% more effective. Explicit correction is 36% effective, and repetition of the mistake with the rising intonation is 31%. So this is telling us something that is really interesting in this study. Please remember that when you're thinking about the effectiveness, you are measuring each one in isolation, not compared to the others. That's why when you add the uptake, it doesn't add to 100. But the results tell us that, first of all, simple recast was most often used, but the least uptake. So students really couldn't, care less. It's like they go through over their heads. The second thing that you find here is that recast may not be perceived as a correction at all. So it's like you say she works in a factory and it's like, whatever. And I don't get it into my mind. However, the best results are gained from some kind of corrective feedback plus some negotiation, some spaces for reflection. And that is where the key is. When you correct, you not only give them the right answer, but you also allow them to think about what they're saying. That's why these ones that I mentioned about inviting students to think, when you make faces, when you say, excuse me, what was that? Those tend to be very, very effective. Almost like imitating Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question. Here it is to interrupt or not to interrupt. Think about a real situation where students are trying to survive in real cases in English, and they will need to be able to negotiate meaning. But from the point of view of interrupting, if you get the message, please do not interrupt. Attention, when I say not interrupting does not mean not providing feedback afterwards. But it's in that moment where they have to think about the best way to solve the problem, where they really find the learning moments. Please don't kill those moments. A teacher who tells them all the time what is right and what is wrong all the time, a teacher who doesn't leave spaces, a teacher who does not leave some silence in between the question and the response, are teachers who are not so effective because you're not allowing your students to think about the answer.